Good morning, everybody. I'm just going to give people a couple more minutes just to log in, and then we'll get going. Okay. I think we'll begin. Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for logging in for today's event. My name is Helen Russell, and I'm a research professor at the ESRI and head of the Social Research Division. And I'm delighted that we're all here today to launch the new study by my colleagues Emer Smith and Merica Darmody on the experience of bullying and bullying behaviours among 13-year-olds. And I'd like to congratulate them both on the new study. The research has been produced as part of a programme of research with the Department of Children, Disability and Equality, which has to date, I think by my reckoning, published 16 reports on a really wide range of issues relating to children and young people. And I think the programme is a really good example of truly collaborative work between policymakers and researchers that has drawn on the wonderful Growing Up in Ireland studies to develop research that addresses, pressing policy issues. I'd like to sincerely thank the department and the steering board members on behalf of the SRI. So they are Ciara Pigeon, Aisling Murray, Nuala Connolly, Grania Collins, and our extern Morag Henderson for that really meaningful collaboration. I think you'll all agree the topic for today's report is one that is extremely important and topical. And I think probably an area where there's particular challenges in ensuring that policy developments keep pace with what's going on in young people's lives. So we have an excellent event, I think, for you today. We'll first of all have a presentation by Professor Emer Smith, and then we are very lucky to have responses from three expert panelists. We have Professor James O'Higgins Norman, who's chair of the DCU Centre on Bullying and Cyberbullying. We have Deirdre McHugh, who's Assistant Director of the National Educational Psychological Service, so NEPS, at the Department of Education, and Dr. Bernadette Ní Onglesh, who is an educational policy consultant. And these three panelists bring a huge wealth of experience in both policy development and practice, and will provide us with their take on the study results and their implications. So I'm going to hand over first to Emer Smith, who's going to take us through the findings. Actually, I should say before you start, Emer, if people, I'm sure you will have lots of questions and responses yourselves to the findings. So please do, as Emer is presenting or as we're discussing on the panel, put your questions in the Q&A, and we will have plenty of time at the end for a general discussion. Thanks very much. Over to you, Emer.
Thank you, Helen. I'll just share my slides and hopefully this will work. Okay, so I'm going to present on behalf of myself and my co-author, Merica Darmody. I'm going to say a little bit about the background to the study, including previous research and the policy context. Talk a little about the prevalence of bullying at ages 9 and 13, about who is bullied and how young people define bullying. We're then going to look at whether they tell someone about being bullied and look at the influence that bullying has on their outcomes. And finally, we're going to talk about the implications for policy and practice. And that's going to be picked up more in the panel discussion in greater detail. So as Helen mentioned, this report is part of a programme of research with the Department of Children, Disability and Equality. I'd like to echo her thanks to them for their support for this and other studies, for their great engagement and collaboration. We're also grateful to the CSO for access to the data, to the GUI study team for creating this beautiful data, and to the families and young people involved in the study who were very giving and generous of their time. So, I mean, as you're all aware, bullying among children and young people remains an issue of policy concern. There have been a good deal of recent policy developments in this space, and we'll be talking about them more in the panel discussion. And more importantly, I think there's been a shift over time, internationally and in Ireland, away from focusing on the psychological characteristics of those who are bullied and even bullied perpetrators, towards seeing bullying in a more nuanced way, seeing it in the context of the broader social dynamics among groups of children and young people. Now, there's a really great advantage. We used Growing Up in Ireland data from Cohort 08, the younger cohort, at both ages 9 and 13. And these data provide very rich information on bullying inside and outside school. And the longitudinal perspective has two advantages. It means we can look at how bullying changes between middle childhood and adolescence. And it also means we can look at how bullying influences young people's well-being and outcomes at a later stage. Now, there's been a good deal of existing research in Ireland on this, much of it done by James O'Higgins Norman, who we'll talk later. It's tended to focus on school-based and cyberbullying rather than bullying outside school. A lot of research to date has been cross-sectional in nature. And if you take an overview of existing studies, we see that prevalence varies very much depending on the methods, the time frame, and the definition used. In terms of what's been found about who is bullied, findings are consistent that it tends to be more prevalent at primary level than at second level. And also that being seen as different because of group membership or appearance provides a kind of a basis for being bullied in many contexts. However, there's been quite a variation in the findings on whether bullying levels overall vary by gender and social background. As I said, there's been a good deal of policy concern with bullying. Dating back to 1993, there were guidelines on countering bullying in schools. These were revised with the 2013 Action Plan on Bullying. And both of these initiatives provided a basis for schools to develop their own anti-bullying policies and guidelines for so doing. We also saw an important signal in the setting up of the National Anti-Bullying Research Centre at DCU in 2014. More recently, there's been a good deal of review of bullying policies involving extensive consultation with stakeholders, including children and young people, that resulted in Cineáltas, the Action Plan on Bullying, which was issued in 2022 with accompanying procedures and guidelines in 2024. And that has shifted really towards a whole education and very much a child's rights focus to guide schools on how to develop policies that involve all of the stakeholders, including children and young people. There has been a parallel development of anti-bullying policies in sports and other youth organisations, but there's been much less research on this issue to date than on school-based bullying. So if we start off by looking at the 9-year-olds, 9-year-olds were asked in Growing Up in Ireland if they had been picked on over the past year. And they were prompted that could be either by a child or by an adult. What we see is that the overall level is 4 and 10, 41% of 9-year-olds. The overall level doesn't vary very much by gender, but what we do see is gendered patterns in the type of bullying experienced. So girls are more likely to report having been socially excluded, left out of things than boys, and boys are more likely to report having been physically pushed or shoved than girls. When we look at all the factors simultaneously in modelling, we again see no significant difference by gender, but again, the type varies, physical bullying versus more social exclusion. We find no significant difference by socioeconomic background, and we measure this in terms of social class and whether the household had experienced financial strain, in other words, whether they had difficulty making ends meet. We also saw no difference by migrant background, which was a little different than some other studies. Now, Now, part of this might be due to the nature of the Growing Up in Ireland sample. These children were first sampled at 9 months. So almost all had been born in Ireland. So their experiences might be expected to differ from those of more recent arrivals. We find a significant difference by bullying by disability. So we define disability as having a long-term illness, condition or disability that hampers children's lives to at least some extent. And so this group were more likely to be bullied. Also, where the family had no religious affiliation, bullying levels were higher. And those who were underweight or overweight were more likely to be picked on at age 9. If we compare DEIS and non-DEIS schools, we don't see a raw overall difference at primary level, but what we do see are lower levels of social exclusion. Now, there are 2 potential reasons for that. It could be to do with the additional supports that are given to DEIS schools that enable a greater degree of inclusion among students. Alternatively, it could be because young people or children attending DEIS primary schools are much more likely to live in the local neighbourhood. So that combination of school and neighbourhood networks may help avoid social exclusion, but this would merit further study. We also find that children who feel that their teacher treats pupils unfairly are more likely to be bullied. And on closer inspection, that is linked to kind of feelings of broader disengagement from school. It's a small group at the stage of 9, but this group are disengaged from school and perhaps because of school absence or other factors are less have less positive relationships with their peers. Interestingly, we find no significant difference by whether the child had peer problems at age 9, which adds kind of evidence to this idea of seeing bullying as not as a response to individual psychological issues, perhaps, but more as related to the social dynamics of peer formation and reformation. Now, at age 13, we had 2 different measures, and I think this provides important insights. The first was a direct question. Have you been bullied in the last 3 months? And 8% said they had. But then we said, have you experienced any of the following from a child or young person in the last 3 months? And this ranged from physical things like being hit, pushed, social issues like name calling, being socially excluded, and also then kind of online or digital experiences, having notes or photos or videos shared, upsetting, being upset by hurtful messages by text or online. So if we look at experiencing any one of those, we see the majority, 62%, have kind of experienced one of those on at least one occasion. But if we look more at repeated behavior, so experiencing one of those behaviors 2 or more times, we see it's 37%. So around the same proportion as said they had been picked on at age 9. So if we look briefly at what kinds of behaviours are more prevalent, we see that being socially excluded or left out and being called names are quite common, but also levels of physical bullying, hit or pushed, are also more prevalent. We can see in comparison that kind of more online or digital behaviour is less common than these traditional forms of bullying. But if we put them all together, about 20% have experienced some kind of digital or online bullying. Now, if we look together at what are the characteristics associated with having experienced bullying, so those who answered the direct question, were you bullied? And they said yes. So they're a small group. We don't see that differing by gender or social background. We see, again, it's higher, 8 percentage points higher among those with a disability, which is quite high because we have a low baseline of 8%. Those young people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual or questioning have a higher instance of bullying, as do those who are overweight. We see that peer groups make a difference. So those who have more close friends at age 13, that tends to have a protective effect. But having older friends is a risk factor. So those who have kind of socialized with an older peer group are more likely to have been bullied. And that's kind of consistent with work we've done on other topics where that tends to expose young people to more risky behavior. And perhaps to a more unequal kind of power dynamic in the relationship. We see also rates are higher in DESH schools. And we see, probably not surprisingly, that being picked on at age 9 is a significant risk factor for being bullied at age 13. But interestingly, we find that disability, sexual orientation, and being overweight have significant direct effects on being bullied at 13 over and above those earlier experiences of bullying. Now, if we broaden out to look at who experience bullying behavior, so these aren't necessarily people who defined it as bullying, but they kind of said they had experienced bullying behaviors. So we see that girls are more likely to say they've experienced bullying behaviors on terms of social behaviors, especially social exclusion. Those with a disability, especially those with an emotional disability, are more likely to experience social and cyberbullying rather than physical bullying. And for LGBTQ young people, kind of the main types of bullying for them are being called names or receiving hurtful texts. We see, as at 9, the rates are slightly higher for those who have no religious affiliation, but it doesn't focus in on one particular bullying type. And we see that weight status, again, matters and is associated with being excluded, called names, but also with some physical type bullying. We also see, as with the label of bullying, that there is a protective effect of having close friends from social bullying, but having older peers or older friendship group is linked to higher rates of physical and social type behaviors. As at 9, DESH is non-significant overall, but again, we see lower rates of social exclusion, which might link to the supports or neighbourhood factors that we talked about earlier. Only the majority of schools have rely on a student support team as the main source of socio-emotional support for students. And where they have such a team, the level of physical bullying tends to be less in the school. And as you might expect, being picked on at age 9 is an important risk factor for both physical and social bullying at age 13. Now, as you've noticed, there is a discrepancy between how young people answer the direct question about being bullied and how they indicate their experience of bullying behaviours. So we try to exploit that to look at, like, what do young people count as bullying? So it tends to be repeated behaviour. It tends to be behaviour by the same person or people. And when asked about harm in terms of being made angry, upset, or afraid by the behaviour, young people are more likely to consider it as bullying if it causes harm, but especially being made angry is more likely to be involved, to kind of make them label that as bullying. If we look at types of behaviour, we can see that young people are more likely to label some of the kind of digital or cyberbullying, like circulating an upsetting photo or something hurtful being posted online, as bullying, and they're also more likely to label name calling as bullying. But they're really not likely to label being pushed, threatened, or socially excluded as bullying, which is interesting. Now, when we asked them if they had told anyone who experienced any bullying behaviour was asked if they had told an adult about this. So we find that those who labelled the experience as bullying, the majority, 70% of them, told an adult. But when we look at those who experienced any bullying behaviour, that was lower at 42%. And we find that some groups are more likely to report than others over and above their experiences, the type of experiences. We find girls are much more likely to report than boys, 13 to 16%, percentage points higher. Those with disability are more likely to tell an adult, and that difference is even bigger for those who have a learning disability. And interestingly, young people living in a lone parent family are more likely to tell an adult, as are those who are overweight. And those who are groups who are less likely to report are those who have a minority religion or no religious affiliation, and those who are underweight. But telling an adult also reflects the kind of bullying experience. So those who are bullied, in keeping with the descriptive patterns, so they're much more likely, 23 percentage points more likely to tell an adult than those who have experienced bullying behaviour but not labelled it as bullying. Interestingly, more frequent bullying behaviours in itself is not a significant driver of telling an adult. But young people are more likely to tell an adult if it's kind of digital, so hurtful material online or by text, if there's gossip about them or name calling and social exclusion. But they're much less likely to tell someone if the behaviour relates to being hit or pushed. They're more likely to tell an adult, not surprisingly, if they see the behaviour is causing them harm, especially upset. We looked at a range of family and school factors to see if there was any circumstance in, if the broader social context made young people more likely to tell someone. What we actually found is that there were very few differences. Young people were more likely to tell an adult if their mother was seen as more responsive on a scale of how responsive to their needs they were. But when we looked at the quality of relationships with teachers or friends, that wasn't a significant influence on the likelihood of telling someone about the bullying behaviour. And that's kind of a challenge to schools. And contrary to what we expected, we might have expected if there were more positive interactions with teachers that they might be more likely to tell someone. But it comes across with, kind of some of those challenges about being seen to tell that were revealed by the DCU consultation with young people. Now, an advantage of growing up in Ireland data was that it was possible to look at how the young people felt themselves as a result of the bullying behaviour. So whether it made them afraid, angry, or upset. But we could also look at how those who've experienced bullying compared to young people of similar characteristics in terms of two important outcomes. So that they are well-being, measured by the mental health inventory 5. So the higher values are more positive well-being, and then depression scores as measured by the short moods and feelings questionnaire. And so higher scores are indicative of more depressive symptoms, but not necessarily of a depression diagnosis. So if we look first at young people's own reports of how they felt in response to experiencing bullying behaviour. So you can see the majority felt angry or upset, at least to some extent, but a smaller group said it had a lot of impact. It's less likely to result in feelings of fear, though it is the case for about a quarter feel at least a little fear. That pattern is quite different by gender. We see that girls are much more likely to report feelings of fear, anger, and being upset. And that's quite a high proportion of the majority of girls, over 3/4, are upset by the bullying behaviour they've experienced. So we put those three dimensions together and formed a scale of perceived harm. We can see that greater harm is caused if the behaviour is defined as bullying, if it's more frequent. The highest impact was from being socially excluded, followed by other aspects of social exclusion like name calling and being gossiped about. But also online behaviour was associated with greater harm. Interestingly, the more physical forms of being hit or pushed or shoved weren't seen as significantly associated with harm. Now, it's not clear if that relates to a kind of laddish construction of behaviour as normal, or not talking about the impact it has. But again, that would merit further discussion. Girls are more likely to say, as you've seen in the chart, that the behaviour causes harm, and LGBTQ young people are as well. Now, if we turn to the kind of outcomes at age 13, and this is the descriptive pattern before I look at all the factors together. So you can see that those who weren't picked on at 9 have higher well-being. At 13, those who have been bullied have lower well-being. If we divide up the scale of bullying behaviours into low, medium, down to high, you can see that a drop in well-being with a particular drop for the high group. Now, if we look at all those factors together and take account of social characteristics, we can see that being picked on at age 9 is linked to poorer well-being at 13, over and above whether young people are bullied at 13. Those who are bullied at age 13 have poorer well-being at age 13. Now, we have to be cautious about how to interpret that, because it could be young people have poor well-being because they're being bullied, but it could also be that poor well-being and, associate manifestations might make people a target. So we just have to be cautious about that. But what's interesting, that these differences are found even when we take account of prior emotional difficulties at age 9. So it's not the case that all we're picking up is that young people are more vulnerable because they have socio-emotional difficulties. That, we're partialing that out, giving us a clearer picture of the net impact. We see the strongest relationship from social exclusion. So being socially excluded is at age 9 or 13 is associated with poor well-being, as is having property taken or damaged at 13. And what's interesting is that we see a well-being gap by gender, sexual orientation, and being overweight. So those groups have poorer well-being. But bullying partly explains that gap. So it gives us insights into what's driving group-based differences in well-being. But it explains very little of the gap we see in disability in well-being. Now, if we turn to depression score, we see a slight difference at age 9, but not as large as we saw for well-being. We see a marked difference between the bullied and not bullied in depression scores. And again, we see this increase with increased bullying behaviours and quite a kind of jump, if you like, for the highest group. We see that being bullied at age 9 is associated with depressive symptoms. As with well-being, we need to be a little bit cautious about the direction of that relationship. As you saw in the chart, being picked on at age 9 has only marginal effects if we take account of current bullying. But what's interesting is if young people felt they were socially excluded or left out at age 9, they do have more depressive symptoms later on, all else being equal. Depressive symptoms are greater if bullying behaviour is more frequent and the same person or people are involved. It's strongly linked, as with well-being, more strongly with social exclusion, being threatened, name calling, and interestingly being pushed or shoved. So there might be some evidence of impact there that isn't being acknowledged by the largely boys that are concerned. And as with well-being, we're seeing that bullying partly explains the gender gap by the gender gap in depression, but also the gap by sexual orientation or religion. But it actually explains all of the disability gap in depression and being overweight. So just to conclude, what we've tried to show is that the estimates of bullying depend on the definition used. There's been a lot of media and popular focus on cyberbullying, but traditional bullying is more prevalent among the group. That it's very much based on the construction of difference within schools, within other organisations, reflecting that in wider society, construction of difference on the basis of disabilities, sexual orientation, religion and weight status. The broader peer group has both protective and risk effects, but we find actually remarkably few differences by school or classroom factors. As we've said, a significant proportion don't tell an adult about it. 30% of those were bullied, as opposed to 58% of those who experienced any bullying behaviour. And young people see this as causing them harm, and we see it as linked to their well-being and depression levels. So just in terms of implications, and we'll obviously be able to get into this in much greater detail in the panel discussion and hopefully the Q&A. What struck us most is the potential differences between how bullying is defined by young people and by schools and other organisations, which has consequences for whether people tell an adult or not. So what we're finding is that social exclusion is not always defined as bullying, but it is found to have the greatest impact on perceived harm, well-being and depression. So that really highlights the importance of inclusive language and policies to encompass social exclusion. At the moment, we have schools that have anti-bullying policies targeting repeated behaviour and code of conduct that encompasses one-off incidents. But these need to be complementary and rooted in fostering a positive school climate. And I know Bernadette is going to maybe reflect on that issue a little later. It's really important that bullying policies reflect the lived experience of young people and that they're involved in policy co-creation, in schools, other organisations, and indeed in the digital space. The findings point to ongoing challenges to the inclusion of young people with a disability. So we really need further research on how best to tackle bullying and exclusion for that group. We also see concerning evidence of homophobic behaviour and the need to counter this and other group-based prejudices within and outside schools. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Emer, for a wonderfully clear presentation of the study results. I think there's some really stark findings there about the experiences of bullying behaviour and their impacts. And I think you also raise really interesting questions there at the end around how are we defining bullying in a way that's consistent and capturing young people's experiences and how that's linked to reporting or not reporting the behaviour to an adult. So as I said, we are very lucky to have three very distinguished respondents here. Before I introduce the first one, I'll just remind you again that if you have questions that you want to ask that have occurred to you during that presentation, please put them in the Q&A and we'll address them at the end. And you can also put in questions for our panelists who've kindly agreed to stay on online for that discussion as well. So first up, I'm going to hand over to Professor James O'Higgins Norman, who is chair of the Anti-Bullying Centre in DCU and has been a very significant figure in policy development in this area and has led, as Emer said, a wide range of studies on this topic. So James, I'm going to hand over to you.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks, Helen, for your very kind introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to join this important discussion as we are launching today these important findings from the ESRI on school bullying among 9 and 13-year-olds. And congratulations to Emer and Marike for a really great report. So I'd like to begin by recalling the story from the Irish actress Saoirse Ronan, who's now obviously one of our most celebrated performers. And she's spoken openly about being bullied at school herself when she was younger. She recalled how she often felt isolated and picked on because she was different. And what stands out for me in her story is that even someone who would go on to achieve global success can carry the hurt of those early experiences. Her story reminds us that bullying is not just about childhood spats. It can in fact leave lasting scars that shape confidence and well-being and even the way that young people see their future and what's possible for them. The results of the survey that we're launching here today bring us back to the lived realities of children in Ireland today. At age 13, nearly 2/3 have reported experiencing bullying type behaviours in just the last 3 months, being hit, called names, or being excluded. Yet only 8% of them describe these experiences as being bullied. Among 9-year-olds, about 4 in 10 said they had been picked on in the past year. And those who have special needs, who are overweight, or who identify or are perceived as LGBTQ+ are of particular risk. Perhaps most worrying is the long shadow that bullying can cast. Research has shown that children who are picked on at age 9 are more likely to report poorer well-being and higher depression scores by the time they are 13. So this is not just a passing playground issue, it shapes mental health, confidence, and learning well into adolescence and beyond. But here's the crux. If children don't name their experiences as bullying, they're far less likely to tell an adult or to seek help. Recognition matters. Naming matters. And unless we build a culture where children feel safe, supported, and understood, too many will continue to suffer in silence. This is where our National Action Plan on Bullying, Cineáltas, and particularly the UNESCO whole education approach comes into play. Tackling bullying cannot be confined to a single policy document, an annual awareness week, or a classroom lesson here and there. It requires a shift across the entire education environment, involving everyone, students, teachers, SNAs, school leaders, parents, and the wider community. A whole education approach begins with shared definitions and language. Children, teachers, and SNAs and families need to understand that bullying is not just physical aggression, it includes exclusion, persistent teasing, and online harassment. And these are underpinned by social norms and cultures. When everyone recognizes these behaviors for what they are, bullying, prevention and intervention become possible. It also requires embedding prevention into the curriculum. Social and emotional learning, empathy, respect for diversity, and digital citizenship cannot be optional extras. They need to be core to our school curriculum. And that's been called out in the action plan on bullying, Cineáltas, across 61 actions that have been set out for us all to achieve. And they need to be woven into everyday teaching so that children grow up with the skills to navigate conflict, difference, and relationships. A whole education approach also means supporting teachers and SNAs and other school staff. They must be trained not only to spot the obvious signs of bullying, but also the subtle, often hidden dynamics that children themselves may not identify. And they need the resources and the authority to respond quickly and effectively to school bullying situations. We must, of course, ultimately empower students. Peer-to-peer initiatives, buddy systems, and student-led campaigns have all been shown in research to change cultures from the inside out. Children, when they're given their agency, are often the first to see when something is wrong, and they can be powerful advocates for kindness and inclusion in our schools. Crucially, this whole education approach that's recommended by UNESCO extends beyond the school gates, frequently involves being online and taking account of what's happening online. Our research here at DCU found that there is a strong overlap between online and offline bullying. Parents and families need to be part of the conversation, equipped with the tools and language to talk to their children about bullying and to work in partnership with schools. And community services also need to be involved, such as mental health supports and youth organisations. These should all be linked in to ensure that children who are struggling get the help that they need. At its heart, the whole education approach recognises that bullying is not an isolated behaviour. It reflects wider patterns of how we treat each other in society. By creating an environment where respect and empathy and inclusion are modelled and reinforced at every level, we not only reduce school bullying, but we also strengthen the foundations for learning, for well-being, and for resilience. So as we digest today's findings, let's not only focus on the numbers, though they are stark enough, but also on the clear direction that they give us. Bullying is common and its harms are lasting, and children cannot always recognize or name it on their own. It's up to us as educators, policymakers, and communities to put in place structures and programs, interventions, and most importantly, cultures that will protect them. Returning to Saoirse Ronan's story, she once said that being bullied made her want to prove people wrong. but it also made her determined to create safe spaces for others. If even one child feels seen, supported, and understood, then they won't have to carry those scars into adulthood. That is why a whole education approach, as recommended by UNESCO and it's embedded in our National Action Plan, Cineáltas, it really matters. And because every child deserves not just to survive at school, but to truly thrive. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. That's really interesting, and I think a really important point about the importance of naming these and of the culture, I suppose, the wider culture and that whole school, and empowering students. I think that's very powerful. We will, as I say, come back to you again at the end, and hopefully have some further discussion of those points that you're raising. So next we have Deirdre McHugh from the NEPS service. So Deirdre, who's assistant director there. Deirdre, I'm very happy to have you here. And
that's right. Thank you. Thanks very much, Helen. Thanks for the invitation. And I suppose I'm here talking about NEPS, but also some of the other initiatives in the department relevant to the findings of the report as well. So, as Emer mentioned, like, we know that bullying can have a really negative effect on well-being and mental health. So I want to outline some policy developments in the department, in the Wellbeing Office, in which I work, and other kind of work in the department that are relevant, particularly counselling and mental health initiatives, also SPHE, Cineáltas that James referenced there, and student participation. So the Wellbeing Policy Statement and Framework for Practice it provides us with, well, you're probably familiar with that, with an overarching framework for schools to support wellbeing in the school community. And it includes preventing and, of course, addressing bullying. And you'll be very aware that the Cineáltas Action Plan on Bullying has drawn on the department's wellbeing policy and statement for practice, as well as the UNESCO whole school approach as well, and developed through 4 lenses. One lens is in relation to wellbeing promotion, which is culture and environment, curriculum, including teaching and learning, policy and planning, relationships and partnerships. And our wellbeing policy draws really heavily also on risk and protective factors in schools, and on while many influences lie outside of the school gates, as mentioned already there by James as well, school life can actually be such a powerful context for that healthy development, strengthening school-based protective factors, such as those good relationships in schools, coping skills, nurturing resilience, and minimising those risk factors that lead to better outcomes for well-being of children, young people. So the goal of the many programmes and initiatives, such as the work that we're doing in NEPS and broadly in the department, supports reducing risk factors and increasing those protective factors. So I'm going to give just a few examples. So firstly, there's a pilot of counselling and mental health initiatives, and there's 2 strands to that work, and they were launched back in June 2023. And strand 1 involves counselling supports to 7 counties, and this was then extended to 61 urban GESH schools in the Dublin area as well in 2024. And then strand 2 involves wellbeing supports in schools in 4 clusters broadly in the Dublin area, with the introduction of what we're calling education wellbeing practitioners, a new initiative under the supervision and work and direction of NEPS psychologists. So the education wellbeing practitioner provides support to pupils and parents and to staff, and provides preventative evidence-based interventions such as group work, skill building, wellbeing ambassadors, which is that kind of peer-to-peer initiatives mentioned there already, the importance of those, and really to prevent mild and emergent social emotional difficulties. And the Centre for Effective Services was appointed to undertake an evaluation, and that is underway. Also, Cineálta is a new national programme of mental health and wellbeing resources and training for post-primary schools, and it was launched in January, and it's delivered by Jigsaw in partnership with NEPS, and with a particular focus on those student support teams that were mentioned earlier, and the importance of the work that they do to improve wellbeing and reduce bullying in schools. So the program provides a range of supports to parents and teachers for students, so live webinars, e-learning training, programs for TY, also masterclasses for student support teams. We're having in-person conferences this year, podcasts for parents, and then linked to the findings mentioned as well, there's a strong focus on actively seeking the voice of young people in the work that we're doing there as well. A focus on minority work stream with the objective of enhancing school staff's ability to understand mental health of minority groups, those with the LGBTQI+ community, those international students and children with special educational needs. Importantly to mention too, and exciting developments this year, that we're at a really important juncture in reviewing our wellbeing policy in education. We've initiated that with an internal review and audit here in the department. We're working with some of Emer's colleagues in the SRI in relation to an academic review about international and national best practice that will inform our plan and thinking, and then we'll be starting to engage in a broader stakeholder engagement this particular academic year, and that's going to result in a successor to the wellbeing policy and implementation plan, with new new and adapted thinking in that area, which will overlap with many of the themes mentioned here today. So other important initiatives as well linked to the findings in relation to Cineáltas, particularly in the action plan. A recent Cineáltas implementation report outlined that since 2023, 56 of those actions, of the 61 actions, were progressed in that action plan, with 5 being fully implemented, so some good progress there. And the updated by Cineálta procedures for schools were published in June 2024, and they're due to be implemented now this academic year. So these were updated guidelines from 2023, and they now take account of gender identity bullying, cyberbullying, racist and sexist bullying, and sexual harassment. And a suite of professional learner supports and resources are available for school staff, and resources for boards and management as well, and parents. So also in June 2024, the Inspectorate now have published their first of 5 annual reports on bullying behaviour in school, based on survey responses from children, young people, parents and teachers. Really important work that will inform our thinking and planning into the future, and the Inspectorate plan to publish the second report on bullying as part of the annual report in the coming months. And there's also been reference today to the importance of coping strategies and SPHE. And important SPHE programme at junior cycle has been in place since September 23, so just important to note that. And new programmes are being phased in the next 2 years at senior cycle, starting now in September. And these programmes are aimed at helping students understand the factors that shape their thoughts and their emotions and their behaviour, and support them to build those healthy relationships. Also, as part of this work, resources were created through a partnership with the HSC, NEPS and the National Council for Curriculum Assessment on emotional wellbeing. So really important to embedding those prevention, teaching and learning and prevention into the curriculum on an everyday basis. Under Cineáltas, the department is also providing funding to WebWise, which was developed as a dedicated, they've developed a dedicated school hub for teachers to give advice and support and about the safe use of the internet, including issues such as cyberbullying and online harassment as well. And as part of this work, very importantly, as James alluded to there and is very familiar with, is the work with the Anti-Bullying Centre in DCU and the funding towards some of the work that's going on there, particularly to expand the online anti-bullying programmes to reach more students. And they're particularly for students from third year right up to, or third class up to third year. And in 24-25, 1,160 primary schools and 540 post-primary schools have used the FUSE programme, which is really great to see that progress. And we know now as well that the Anti-Bullying Centre are currently developing a module more suitable for special schools and special classes to be piloted and launched hopefully in 26-27. We also know how important it is to co-create and to listen to the voice of children and young people. So there's been a lot of work going on in the background and initiatives underway with the department establishing a student participation unit in April 2024, and an expert group on student participation was chaired by Professor Laura Lundy and established in May 23 to advise on how best to progress this work. And the report of the expert group was published along with the department's student participation implementation plan in October 24. This work involved 174 children and young people and involved in an advisory group, a child and youth advisory group who were involved throughout the process. And a student participation and implementation group has also been established to oversee the implementation of 50 actions. And the report will be heavily influenced by the views of children and young people. And then just finally, the department is commencing work in relation to the guidance for the establishment of student councils in post-primary schools, as well as guidance for primary schools. And we really want to ensure that there's student councils in all schools, but that really importantly that they're meaningful and that they really truly represent the wide student body there. So I've given you a broad brushstrokes of some of the work that's gone on, very relevant to the findings today. A lot of work done, a lot more to do. I think the wellbeing policy review will sit very nicely now this year, taking account of some of what Emer mentioned in the report and what Professor O'Higgins-Norman mentioned as well. And we look forward to engaging with you all in that stakeholder process to come. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Deirdre. There's a huge amount of policy development going on there, and so it's really good to hear about all of those strands. And again, really interesting, I think, to hear that the involvement of students and the student voice. I think echoing, I think, some of the points that James was making. So really interesting to hear about that participation. Thank you very much. And next up, we have Bernadette Ní Anglais, who is an education policy consultant and who brings with her a huge wealth of experience and in practice and I suppose in on the more academic side. But that experience includes being a school principal and an educator of teachers. So I think that'll be really interesting to hear Bernadette's perspective on the study and I suppose of how a lot of the initiatives that we've been hearing about, maybe how they land on the ground. So over to you, Bernadette.
Gormina mai got Helen agus Gies Marie-Evelig Margin. Thank you very much, Helen, and good morning to all. I'm very pleased to be part of this important launch event. Now, I have a few opening words and I will follow that with 3 short reflections on the report, and I'll close with 2 related questions. So at the very outset, I warmly congratulate Professor Emer Smith and Dr. Merica Darmody and the ESRI on the research report. Firstly, on the clarity and the accessibility of the report in terms of language and methodology particularly. And secondly, on the robustness of the data checks and the adjustments that were made to the various data models in order to capture the nuances and the sensitivities of the individual child who had responded, of in-school and out-of-school factors, and what I see as the unrelenting complexities around bullying, experiences of bullying and bullying behaviours. And as we know, those complexities are all interrelated with dynamic, porous boundaries. And thirdly, this report is very timely. A new school year has just opened. I can hear the voices outside in the neighbouring school. The voices of 9-year-olds and 13-year-olds are loud and clear in the ESRI report, and they're central to it. And the findings in the report, some very concerning, but they do provide important insights into the lived realities of those young people and children, of their experiences of bullying and bullying behaviours. And those insights will be helpful to schools in their day-to-day work of nurturing and, more importantly, sustaining safe, inclusive places of learning and teaching. And I also think that the longitudinal nature of the report will be of particular interest to school leadership and boards of management in looking afresh at their school policies, not alone those relating to behaviour, Cineálta and wellbeing, but also their school policy on inclusion, diversity and student voice. And the report, in my view, is an opportunity for us all to pause and reflect in the first instance. I also wish to congratulate the Department of Children, Disability and Equality on the research partnership with ESRI that facilitated this very fine report, and together had the shared vision to use the Growing Up in Ireland data to illuminate that continuum of experiences of bullying of 9 and 13-year-olds. Very rich data that straddles in school, out of school, primary, post-primary, middle childhood and early adolescence. And the report, as we know, and as we've heard this morning, provides very good insights into the psychosocial context of bullying and the profound impact of bullying on children's lives. And critically, that lingering corrosive harm of being picked on at 9 years of age and experiencing bullying behaviours 4 years later. So, having said those just few words, I have 3 short reflections now on the report, and they're located in the policy space. Firstly, in terms of framing behaviour-related policies, the matter of gender and the voice of parents as members of school communities. The findings in the ESRI report are particularly relevant to school policies Cineálta to prevent and address bullying, and also the policy, the Code of Behaviour. And the findings will be helpful to schools in their review process and the updating of those policies. ESRI findings in this report, they point, and Emer has spoken about it this morning, they point to gendered experiences of types of bullying behaviour. So we heard about that the physical bullying behaviours like pushing and shoving were more likely to be experienced by boys, but social bullying behaviours were reported more by girls. We're talking about social exclusion, name-calling, gossiping, hurtful communications, real and cyber. And the depth of emotional harm that ensues, with girls reporting more feelings of anger, upset, and being more afraid than boys. So, social exclusion bullying behaviours, therefore, in my view, needs to feature high up on school policies as serious dysregulated behaviours to be prevented in the first place, and then how they will be dealt with at school level if they do occur, and in the process clarifying behavioural expectations of students and consequences, and mindful especially of situated contextualities, and critically, the supports in place for students, supports in school and out of school in the community, the supports that are in place for students, encouraging them to talk and to tell. I suppose the key question is, why are these behaviours occurring and why now? And this opens up the important role of parents and guardians as primary educators who know their children and their young people particularly well and are in a position to provide invaluable insights and guidance in relation to supporting and responding to student needs. And this brings me to my next point, the other voices, the seldom heard voices. I think the ESRI report is a clarion call to ensure that the seldom heard voices are heard in school policy development. And in this report, those voices are, and we heard about children and young people with a disability, LGBTQ students, and those who struggle with weight status, because they are the students in this report who experience the highest levels of bullying behaviours. So those voices and the responsibility on us to ensure that those voices are provided with meaningful, age-appropriate opportunities to have their say in school policies related to behaviour and policies of direct relevance to students. So I'm talking about the Cineálta policy, the Code of Behaviour policy, and the Acceptable Use policy and digital devices. And of course, there are others. However, as Professor Laura Lundy reminded us as far back as 2007, voice is not enough. Critically, these students and all students, they need to hear back in their schools how their views and voices have influenced the updating of their school policies and why some of their ideas and perspectives could not be taken on board at this particular time. and in my view, student councils as inclusive representative spaces for all students in the school would seem to me to be an ideal space to nurture or to ensure and to include the seldom heard voices if we are in earnest about authentic inclusivity of all children and young people in learning settings and respect for diversity. And if we are serious about the rights of students as rights holders and as agentic human beings well capable of contributing to policy renewal and decision making in schools. Which leads me to my final reflection around school climate. It struck me as I read the report, the juxtaposition and the dynamic nature of the situated, almost contra or binary concepts of well-being and harm, inclusion, exclusion, student friendship networks of the same age as a protective buffer to bullying, to the risk factors of friendships with older students, perceptions of relationships and being treated fairly or unfairly in school, protections and risks, the role of language in clarifying or blurring understandings of bullying and experiences of bullying and bullying behaviours inside schools. All of these are very relevant to thinking about an inclusive, engaging school climate. And in that regard, the Inspectorate's thematic report, Reflections on Inclusion in the Irish Education System, in my view, their report addressed these hugely important issues. So I'm going to finish now with two interrelated questions. The report makes references to the school disciplinary climate. And I wonder if the language of discipline, sanctions, rules was removed from behaviour-related policies and our thinking about school climate. Would it shift our gaze more towards a focus on positive, engaging relational spaces for all children and young people in learning settings and in structured social spaces beyond the school? And what might we learn if we truly listen to the voices of the children and the young people in the findings of this very fine ESRI study? Gormagov. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bernadette. That's really thought-provoking for us all. And again, I think really interesting that you raised the student council issue as well around the, them being meaningful and representative and actually having a role in taking on board, so it's one thing asking, but then it's asking the students, but then it's actually how is that influencing policy? Is it really taken on board? And if not, are they, is there some communication and discussion, not a one-way communication about why not? So I think they're all really interesting questions raised. What I'm going to do now is ask all the other our authors and our other panelists to turn on their cameras, and I'll ask you, the audience, please, to add your questions and any comments that you have to the Q&A function there. I don't know, first of all, if Emer and Merica, if you wanted to respond to any of the any of those issues that came up in the panelists' discussions there. Even that last one about the that Bernadette was raising about the disciplinary climate. Is there anything you want to add there before we open out more broadly?
I perhaps have one point to make, and this relates to how to empower young people to talk about incidences of bullying, because sometimes young people feel discouraged, thinking that if you tell, things can get worse. So to kind of have really good communications channels available to young people to share their experience.
Thank you, Merica.
And just to add to that, we're really grateful to all three panelists for their contributions. I think a common theme was really about the importance of listening to children and young people in devising school policies. And I think Bernadette very clearly pointed to the contradiction there in discussions of school disciplinary climate and rules and so on, that often we can be trying to empower students on the one hand, but then we can have quite a rigid or often hierarchical construction of school rules that really don't always value the important things of respect and mutual respect and help prevent bullying, and can get hung up, especially from the perspective of children and young people, on issues around policing uniform and dress and appearance, rather than fundamental issues of perspective. And I think the importance of consulting with young people around school rules and policies around behaviour, and including bullying, but not limited to it, are really important.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm just going to go to the questions here. So I have one here from Keisha Taylor, who is asking about that finding around the greater prevalence of bullying for those who had older friends, and she's asking really about the causality there. You know, do we know whether the children or young people are making friends outside of their age group because they are being bullied, or is it the older friends that are having the risk factor? Is the risk factor itself?
If I could maybe get in on that, and maybe America might like that. I mean, you're absolutely right. We can't unpack the causality direction fully. But other research that America, myself, have done on adolescent behaviour, and work with Anne Nolan on other risky behaviour, just show that socialising with older friends is a risk factor across a number of things: for antisocial behaviour, for drinking, and for earlier sexual initiation. So we're not entirely sure what the driver of socialising with those groups is, but it certainly is a risk factor, and I suspect it goes beyond kind of being a response to being bullied by same age, because it's an even greater risk of being bullied by hanging around with older young people.
And is there a kind of structural or policy element there at all? I'm thinking of the, you know, work that you've done on the mixed age groups in primary school, that you had classes sometimes which were you know, combining different ages, and whether that's you know, whether that's associated with that pattern of peer
That's
influence.
a good point, and something we haven't looked at, but we seem to see that risk factor emerging in adolescence, not in middle childhood. Okay. But yeah, but growing up in Ireland data is brilliant, but we need more information on the dynamics of friendship and exclusion, and how it evolves, in which some people might be experiencing bullying behaviour in one year, and the next year they might be, you know, excluding other people. So we don't have the insights we need, I think, to those issues.
Okay, and so I suppose one of the other questions here on the disability findings. So one of the you know, one of the really strong findings is the greater risk associated with having a disability. So I suppose asking the panel and yourselves more widely, are there, you know, the policy has been around, you know, mainstreaming people with this disability into mainstream school, and you know, is the policy failing, or what are we not doing to support that integration? What more should we be doing in that space? Don't know if any of our panelists would like to come in as well.
I think it's important to remember that we kind of immediately jump to presuming that the bullying that children with additional needs experience is coming from children without additional needs, but often the bullying comes from within that group itself, and it can be to do with how they're working out their dynamics and the power relationships within on the margins of the mainstream group, if you like, within a mainstream school. It's quite complex, but you know, underpinning all bullying is this power dynamic, and if people are perceived to be on the fringe of a group, they're more likely to be targeted. And then we had this phenomenon in bullying where a person who's bullied becomes a bully. So you have this bully victim status, and it's a way of regaining some sense of power themselves, if you like, by nearly passing the bullying on. And so we can see those patterns in other research emerge among children with additional needs and other differences in school communities.
Thank you, James. Okay, I don't see anyone else want to come in. So I've a comment here from Laura McGarrigle, which is around, congratulating the authors, but also saying that, how children are engaged is important, and the framing of that. So discussing in their own children's school, the engagement on the development of the anti-bullying policy was focused on whether they felt physically safe, rather than a broader awareness of the experience and impact of exclusion. So enhancing children's voice. She's saying it's important how that conversation is framed. Is really important too. So I don't know if you have input on that, anyone, James, or anyone else.
I think the enhancement of children's voice is a relatively new a new driver in education. It's, we've talked about it for a long time, but now we have a new unit in the Department of Education that's really going to prioritize it. But it doesn't mean that everybody in every school has the skills to do that work. And we did some research last year on smartphone bans in schools. It was qualitative research. And in every school we went to, a member of staff or the champion in the school of the ban would insist that the students in the school had been consulted and were part of the decision to opt for the ban in whatever form it took in that school. However, when we talked to the students, they told us that there was no consultation or no meaningful consultation, or maybe they were just told by staff that the ban was coming in and they were given the reasons for it, but that they were informed, but they actually weren't consulted. So I think the quality of the consultation speaks to how we conceive schools, how we conceptualize schools. And at the heart of how we conceptualize schools are two important things: how we conceptualize the profession of teaching, and what it means to be a teacher. Am I the person who knows everything and has all the knowledge and will share it all and has all the duty of care and everything else that goes with that? And also then how we conceive childhood. And I think there's a need for us to go right back to basics on both of those if we're going to really get to a point where there is genuine consultation and empowerment of student agency in schools.
If I could come in there,
I
Helen.
see Bernadette.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
And
then Bernadette.
Okay, yeah, thanks. It was just maybe just to give some examples of that and just concur with the main points that were made. But thinking of our wellbeing policy review and what we were trying to do in schools over the last 5 years is encourage schools to review their wellbeing approaches in school, looking at it from a whole school perspective, which would include bullying, and really engage children, young people in that process as well as teachers, and giving schools, surveys, guidelines on focus groups to be able to use for that meaningful engagement. I would agree with James there. I think it's a kind of a novel, not and schools are doing this. Some schools really well, but they need more support. An example of what we're looking at through the NYART program now at the moment, where Jigsaw Nips are working in partnership to work with student support teams, particularly who are responsible group of teachers in the school for the wellbeing approaches and policies, which includes children with special educational needs. It's like a whole school approach using the team in the school. And we have a really strong focus of helping teachers understand how to engage children in a very meaningful way with like live webinars, and some of our in-person conferences next year will be focusing particularly on that to ensure that it's done in a very meaningful way rather in a tokenistic way that they feel heard. Because I know myself from my own children, others, sometimes they say what they want, but they kind of feel that nothing changes or they're not being heard. So I think it's going to be a big focus over the years to come, particularly with the student council focus as well. So there's lots of different ways that we're going to be working to try and manage this, and including wellbeing ambassadors at primary schools is being piloted through some of the wellbeing initiatives. Cineálta are going to do similar at post-primary. So lots of examples of how to really hear the voice of child, use them in a meaningful way to support their peers in school, because we know they listen to each other better than they listen to us as adults, and really wanting to build on that.
Thanks. Bernadette, you were...
Thank you, Helen. And just to add to the contributions by James and Deirdre, many schools have developed really effective ways of including the voice of students in their school life, in school life, both in policy implementation and also just in the life of the school. And interestingly, as well as the student voice is now part as well. It is an important part of school evaluation by the inspectorate. The voice of student is a critical element of that. And there are 2 recent publications that are particularly strong on including the voice. And I think they were particularly supportive. So in terms of the supports that are available, one is the NCSE Relate, which emphasizes the importance of relational pedagogies and the role of adults, co-regulators in that space in a way that encourages student voice. And the other one is the department's publication in relation to understanding behaviours of concern and responding, in crisis situations, but particularly understanding behaviours of concern, that looks at ways of responding, first of all, understanding needs. If we take it that bullying behavior, that all behavior is communication and feelings are perfectly okay, but not all behaviors are okay. But those 2 publications are particularly, I think, very supportive to schools in relation to helping them to understand need, to respond to student needs, and also within that whole of school community, I think, responsibility in this area.
Thanks. Yes, there does seem to be a growing number of resources out there for schools. We've just a couple of minutes left, so maybe it's a slightly unfair question to you all to put you on the spot. There seems to be a lot of policy development interventions. If you had a blank check, what would you prioritize? What would you see as the most effective place to invest? I don't know if you want to prioritize.
That's a very tough question to put us at, Ellen. I would say the investment has to be looking at whole school approaches, and that sometimes, of course, targeted supports are really important. However, I think maybe that whole school approach is maybe sometimes misunderstood. And I think looking at that culture and ethos in the school, looking at kind of trauma-informed approaches, relational approaches at a whole school level is really, really key. And I think that's where we need to focus, and that would be a great benefit to all children. Those with hidden needs, there's many children there that we don't know if they're being bullied, we don't know if they've experienced trauma in their lives or what has happened because of how they're communicating their needs. So I think a bigger focus on that whole school approach and trying to drive that home is really important.
James, I don't know, from your research, have you
well, of course, if you ask a professor what else is needed, he's going to say more research, isn't he? So but I would say I would take what Deirdre said there and I would elevate it to the whole education system, not just the school. So moving from a whole school to a whole education system. So many of the issues we're facing are bigger than any one individual school. They're across the system and across society. So if we could find one mechanism that would link up all the amazing things that are happening across our schools and help them to together meet the challenges, I think that would be really, really amazing. So something like, for example, we were to focus in on student voice, and if we were to in some way be able to put that at the center of all of the education system, and then the ripple effects from that, I think, would be really important, would be really significant. But that would mean in our teacher education colleges that student teachers are learning that they're really in partnership with students in the schools in terms of achieving what they need for themselves to flourish in life. And it would mean that everything we do puts the student truly at the center of the education system rather than any one individual school.
Thank you very much. And we're running up to our final deadline now. I don't know. I would give the last word to the authors. Did you want to?
And if I could just say that I think I would give, if there was funding to give, I would give it to school communities, and to draw out perhaps the key strands of that, what we have discussed this morning, around behaviour, communication, well-being, retaining the child as central. And what might the school community decide where the funding or additional resources might go, with the voice of the student part of that, decision making as regards the money, and the student always remaining central.
Very much. Okay, well, we're now at our 20, so I don't want to hold people from their lunches. I just would like to say again, huge congratulations to America for an excellent report, and one that I think will be really useful for policymakers and practitioners, and to give a huge thank you to our 3 panelists who have really elevated the whole discussion today, and thanks to the audiences as well for participating. So we'll see you all at the next event. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.